Again, on political, the Supreme Court has nullified the judgments of the Court of Appeal and Federal High Court, which sacked Senator Samuel Anyanwu as National Secretary of the People's Democratic Party, PDP. A five-member panel of the Apex Court held that the issue of who is the National Secretary of the PDP borders on the internal affairs of a political party, which is not justiciable. Justice Jamilu Tukal, who delivered the lead judgment of the Supreme Court, consequently struck out the judgment of the trial court delivered in October 2024 and also set aside the majority judgment of the Court of Appeal, which had in December affirmed the sack of Anyanwu as PDP's National Secretary. Joining us on an interview on this matter, Supreme Court setting aside judgment sacking Anyanwu as PDP National Secretary, is the Editor-in-Chief, Judgments of the Supreme Court Reports, Chief Tom Anyafulude. Good evening, Ikenga. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Ngo. Thank you for having me.
Okay, this is the latest development in the PDP National Secretary issue. I don't know what the precedent is. Is it, or rather what you think is legally correct? Should the parties handle their internal affairs, or should the court decide for the parties? Which is the right thing according to the law?
Thank you. A court of law in Nigeria does not have jurisdiction to interfere with the internal affairs of a political party, except on some exceptional situations. Those situations are: one, when the challenge is based on fundamental rights, although it is an internal affair of a political party, but it has fundamental rights connotation, or when it involves the interpretation of the constitutional interpretation, although it is an internal affair of a political party, but you are now invoking the interpretative jurisdiction of a court. These are the two situations where a court can interfere with the internal affairs of a political party. But in this case, the case of Anyanwu, it did not come within the ambit of these two exceptions. So the Supreme Court held that it comes within the general principle that a court of law should not interfere with the internal affairs of a political party.
All right. You were talking about the exceptional circumstances that would have given jurisdiction for the court to decide on the internal affairs of the political party. And you're saying that those particular circumstances were missing. But we have other courts, lower courts, that already delivered judgment and in favor of one party. Why would that happen if the law is certain, is clear on what should be?
The Supreme Court is the final court, and the decisions of the Supreme Court is a vital source of our laws. It adds to the body of laws. When the Supreme Court makes a final decision, it becomes a precedent that can be cited in future litigations. So in this regard now, the Supreme Court has said that a court in Nigeria cannot interfere in the internal affairs of a political party, except on certain situations. So it is now the law. If any other case of this nature comes tomorrow, I can now cite this case of Anyanwu as president. Yes. Remember that there was a time the Federal High Court held that Magu, the present acting chairman of PDP, was validly in office, and his tenure will expire by December 2025. That is a purely internal affairs of a party. Remember that there was a time Labour Party was agitating whether Julius Abure was the validly elected chairman of Labour Party, or whether he ceases to, be the chairman. All those decisions will now disappear from our law reports based on this present decision of the Supreme Court.
Okay, in time past, courts have mediated in matters that should have been ordinarily internal squabbles, but now they are taking a back seat again. on another internal intra-party crisis. Now, I don't know what the implications would be, knowing that Supreme Court's ruling may have a future cases involving intra-party disputes. Probably not the Supreme Court, but other courts. That in the future, this can be cited as a precedent. What does it mean now that the Supreme Court has taken this decision?
Now that the Supreme Court has decided that it has no jurisdiction, we are now going to look at the principle of law. What is the decision? What is the effect? Where a court of law says it has no jurisdiction. That is the simple interpretation of this. There have been back and front, going forward and backwards on this Anyanwu's case. But the question is, what is the principle of law where a court of law has no jurisdiction? Where a court of law has no jurisdiction, that court has not decided anything except that it has no jurisdiction. Consequently, a court which says that it has no jurisdiction cannot make a consequential order, cannot make any order except the order of striking out. This is very important. Where a court has no jurisdiction, it cannot make any order except the order of striking out the matter. Now, where the Supreme Court holds that the trial court has no jurisdiction, the Supreme Court will strike out the case at the trial court, and in extension, will also strike out the case at the appeal, at the Court of Appeal, and the same Supreme Court. Where the Supreme Court holds that the trial court has no jurisdiction, the trial court lacks jurisdiction, the Court of Appeal lacks jurisdiction, and the Supreme Court also lacks jurisdiction. So, the effect is that nothing has been decided. The parties will revert to their positions before going to the trial court.
Okay. Now the matter continues. I don't know if in the future Supreme Court will have influence over the role that judiciary will have to play when it comes to intra-party crisis.
Now, it has been defined. It has always been there. That has always been the law. But the lower courts neglected that principle. They were not adhering to that principle. Now that the Supreme Court has re-emphasized it, that is the law. The Supreme Court cannot overrule itself. There are conditions when the Supreme Court will depart from its previous decisions, but not in this case. So this will be the law, and unless there's an amendment to the existing law, when there's an amendment, then the Supreme Court will interpret based on the new amendment.
Okay, politically speaking, do you think that this will actually resolve this matter, knowing that the Supreme Court has already set aside the judgment that has sacked Anyanwu? Do you think that it's giving the FCT minister a deeper grip on the party? Because if they have to go home to settle their matter away from the judiciary, you see that the chairman or the national chairman of the party is Wike's right-hand man. I don't know what you think the outcome will be if the court hands off it.
The effect now, the question now is, what is the position, what is the standing of the parties? What is the standing of Anyanwu? What is the standing of Udokoye? I told you earlier that the principle is that where a court lacks jurisdiction, the parties will revert to their position before the commencement of the hostilities at the court. Now remember that Anyanwu left the PDP to contest the gubernatorial election in Imo State. Now in his absence, something happened. The Southeast Caucus, allegedly, I'm not there, but allegedly selected Udokoye to replace Anyanwu. Now that nomination was ratified by the National Working Committee on paper. That was what was said. And that was why the PDP and Udokoye approached the Federal High Court. The question is, why should Udokoye and PDP approach the Federal High Court against Anyanwu? And the Federal High Court now said that Udokoye is the secretary. Anyanwu now appealed to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal, Enugu Division, affirmed the decision of the Federal High Court. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that the courts do not have jurisdiction. So what is the position? The position is that the parties will revert to their position before going to the Federal High Court. And what was the position before going to the Federal High Court? The position is that Udokoye was allegedly nominated, and he started functioning as the secretary and was recognized by the NWC. And while the case was even pending, was recognized by the NEC. So the position before now is that the Udokoye is the secretary, especially now that the Supreme Court said that it is the parties, the political party, that will resolve that issue. So what is the decision of the NWC? What is the decision of NEC? That is the question. So in law, as it stands now, it is Udokoye that is the secretary, because he was recognized by NWC. That was why the PDP joined in the action on the side of Udokoye against Anyanwu.
Chief, before I let you go, I'd like to know if there's a violation in some parts or sessions of a party's constitution, if that could be enough reason to take a member of the party to court, when there is a squabble. I know it's internal matter, but it's something like that, an aberration from the constitution, a reason to take a matter to the court?
When there is the court will not interpret the party's constitution. That is an internal affairs of the party. Let the parties resolve their cases. But when it is a constitutional issue, or when there is a breach of the constitution, or when fundamental rights principles are involved, that is when the court will come in. But when it is strictly whether somebody resigned, or whether somebody did not resign, or whether you are supposed to resign before going to contest a further office, these are strictly internal affairs of the parties. And that is what the Supreme Court said, that the court should not be involved in the affairs of internal affairs of a party, whether somebody was duly elected as a chairman, whether his tenure as a chairman has expired, whether somebody is a secretary, whether his tenure has expired, whether somebody can leave the office of secretary and contest for the governor, and after losing come back. These are internal affairs, and the Supreme Court said that it is not within the ambit of jurisdiction of a court of law.
Thank you, Chief Tom Anyafulude, for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
He's the Editor-in-Chief, Judgments of the Supreme Court reports. And our focus was on Supreme Court's setting aside judgment sacking Anyanwu as PDP National Secretary. Just interpreted that verdict right now. We shall return in a bit. Stay with us.
Save Nature TV. News in your pocket.